Tonight, we're going back to a small town in Iowa in 1912. On a quiet Sunday evening, 8 people walked into a house after church. A mother, a father, their 4 children, and 2 young girls who were staying the night. By morning, all of them were dead, killed with an axe while they slept. The killer was never found. But what he left behind, the covered mirrors, the dimmed lamp, the strange objects placed deliberately around the house, tells a story about the kind of person who did this. A story that investigators, psychologists, and researchers have been trying to piece together for over a century. In the first half of this video, we'll go through exactly what happened that night and the investigation that followed. In the second half, we'll look at the psychology behind the crime, what the killer's behavior might reveal about his mind, and why this case still refuses to let people go. This is the story of the Villisca Axe Murders. Villisca, Iowa in 1912 was a small town of about 2,500 people. The kind of place where everyone knew each other, where doors were often left unlocked, and where the biggest event of the week was Sunday church. It sat in the southwestern corner of Iowa, surrounded by farmland, connected to the wider world mostly by the railroad lines that passed nearby. The Moore family was one of the more prominent families in town. Josiah Moore was 43. A successful businessman who had built up his own farm implement dealership. His wife Sarah was 39, active in the community and deeply involved in their local Presbyterian church. Together they had 4 children. Herman was the oldest at 11, then Mary Catherine at 10, Arthur at 7, and the youngest Paul, who was just 5 years old. They lived in a modest but comfortable white frame house on a quiet residential street. By all accounts, the Moores were well liked. Josiah was known as a hardworking man. Sarah was the kind of person who organized things, who held the social fabric of her community together. Sunday, the 9th of June, 1912, was one of those days. Sarah had coordinated the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, a special evening service where the children of the congregation would participate. The whole Moore family attended, and that evening 2 additional girls joined them. Inez May Stillinger, who was 8, and her older sister Lena Gertrude Stillinger, who was 11. Lena and Inez were friends with the Moore children. Mary Catherine had invited them to spend the night at the Moore house after the program. The service ended around 9:30 that evening. The group, Josiah, Sarah, their 4 children, and the 2 Stillinger sisters, walked home together through the quiet streets of Villisca. They arrived at the house sometime between 9:45 and 10 p.m. 8 people walked through the front door that night. By morning, all 8 of them would be dead. The next morning, the 10th of June, the sun came up over Villisca like any other day. At around 7 a.m., Mary Peckham, the Moore's next-door neighbor, noticed something odd. The Moore family hadn't come outside to do their morning chores. The chickens hadn't been let out. No one was moving around the house. Peckham walked over and knocked on the door but received no answer. She tried to open it. It was locked. She let the chickens out herself and then called Ross Moore, Josiah's brother. Ross came over, he knocked and shouted, but there was still nothing. He had his own key to the house, so he unlocked the front door and stepped inside while Mary Peckham stayed on the porch. Ross walked through the parlor and opened the door to the guest bedroom. Inside, on the bed, he found the bodies of Inez and Lena Stillinger. He didn't go any further. He turned around, went back to the porch, and told Peckham to call Hank Horton. Horton was Villisca's primary peace officer. When Horton arrived and searched the rest of the house, he found what Ross Moore couldn't bring himself to see. All 8 of them were dead: Josiah, Sarah, Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, Paul, Inez, Lena. Every single one of them had been bludgeoned in their beds. The murder weapon was found in the guest bedroom where the Stillinger sisters lay. It was an axe. It belonged to Josiah. Doctors would later conclude that the killings had taken place sometime between midnight and 5 a.m. But what the investigators pieced together about those hours painted a picture far worse than anyone in Villisca was prepared for. 2 spent cigarettes were found in the attic. The killer had likely entered the house while the family was still at church. He climbed into the attic and waited, sat in the dark, smoking, listening to 8 people come home, settle in, and fall asleep beneath him. Then he came downstairs and started in the master bedroom, Josiah and Sarah. Josiah received more blows than any other victim. The killer used the blade side of the axe only on him. His face was destroyed. His eyes were gone. The ceiling above the bed had a gouge mark in it from where the killer swung the axe too high on the backswing. Sarah was killed with the blunt end. Then the children's room, Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, Paul, all struck in their beds with the blunt end of the axe, ages 11, 10, 7, and 5. After that, the killer went back to the master bedroom. He delivered more blows to Josiah and Sarah. During this, he knocked over a shoe that had been sitting next to the bed. It had already filled with blood from the first attack. Then he went downstairs to the guest room, Ine and Lena. Investigators believed that 7 of the 8 victims never woke up. They were killed in their sleep. But not Lena, the 11 years old, appeared to have been awake. She was found lying crosswise on the bed. There was a defensive wound on her arm. She had tried to fight back. Her body had been moved after death. She was placed on her stomach. Her undergarments had been removed. Her body had been positioned in a way that investigators believed was deliberate. At the time, law enforcement speculated that the killer may have molested her. Later investigations found no evidence that this actually occurred, but someone had taken the time to move her, to arrange her. And he wasn't done. After the killings, the murderer did something that no one in Villisca could explain. He covered every mirror in the house, every single one. He pulled clothing and blankets from dressers and draped them over any reflective surface he could find. He took a kerosene lamp, removed its glass chimney, and turned the wick down to the lowest possible glow. Just enough light to see by, not enough to be seen. He took a 4-pound slab of bacon from the icebox and placed it on the floor next to the axe. Investigators found bloody water on the kitchen table. Untouched food sat nearby. And then he locked every door in the house from the inside and left. What happened next may have sealed the fate of this case forever. After Horton's initial search of the house, people were allowed inside to view the scene. At around 8:40 a.m., the town's central telephone office issued what was called an all-call, a message sent to every household in Villisca at once. 8 people had been murdered in the Moore house. Within minutes, the house was flooded with townspeople. They walked through the rooms, they stepped through blood, they touched everything. The axe, the murder weapon, was handled by hundreds of people who passed through the house that morning. Some of them took souvenirs. Pieces of Josiah Moore's skull were pocketed and carried home. The sheriff tried to regain control of the scene. He couldn't, not for hours. The county coroner, Dr. Lindquist, arrived at approximately 9 a.m. He viewed the scene himself, and then met with Horton and Sheriff Orrin Jackson to go over what little information they had managed to collect. Lindquist was furious. The constant stream of townsfolk was destroying whatever evidence might have remained. He urged the sheriff to call in the National Guard to secure the house. By 10:30 a.m., the Guard had established a perimeter, but by then, the damage was done. A local druggist showed up with a camera. Photography was his hobby, and he wanted to document the scene. He was turned away. He was told that taking photographs would be too ghoulish. This was 1912. At the time, many drugstores actually sold postcards of crime scenes. The man may have had more than just curiosity driving him, but regardless, he was dismissed, and with him went one of the few chances to preserve a visual record of the untouched scene. Lindquist called the members of the coroner's jury together that afternoon, but it was several more hours before they actually entered the house to view the bodies. It wasn't until after 10 p.m. that night that County Attorney Ratcliffe finally gave the undertaker permission to remove them. The fire station had been set up as a temporary morgue. It was close to 2 a.m. before all 8 bodies had been transported there. Nearly 24 hours after they were killed. For an entire day, the victims of the Villisca Axe Murders lay in the house where they died. The town walked through the rooms around them. Evidence was carried off in people's pockets, and the one person who wanted to take photographs was told it would be in poor taste. Everything that might have helped solve this case was gone before the investigation ever really began. The autopsies confirmed what was already obvious. All 8 victims died from severe head trauma. Doctors narrowed the time of death to sometime between midnight and 2 a.m. One question kept coming up. How did someone move through a compact, creaking farmhouse in the middle of the night and kill 8 people without a single one of them waking up in time to cry out or escape? Newspapers at the time floated a theory. Maybe the killer had put a sedative in the family's milk or cocoa before they went to bed. It was a reasonable guess, but toxicology studies weren't a routine part of autopsies in 1912. No one tested for it. No one could confirm or rule it out. Beyond the crime scene details that had already been cataloged, investigators found only a handful of additional clues. In the barn behind the house, they found an imprint pressed into the hay. It was next to a knothole in the wall. Someone had been lying there, watching the house through that small hole, possibly for a long time before the family even left for church that evening. Downstairs, a fragment of a keychain was recovered. It didn't belong to anyone in the Moore family. No one could explain where it came from or who had left it behind. That was it. That was nearly everything the investigation had to work with. On the 11th of June, 1912, just one day after the bodies were discovered, the coroner held an inquest. 13 people were interviewed as potential witnesses. No arrests were made, no clear suspect emerged, and the physical evidence that might have pointed somewhere had already been walked through, picked up, and carried home by half the town. In the weeks and months that followed, suspects began to pile up, but none of them stuck. The list eventually included a traveling minister, a state senator, an ex-convict, a convicted killer, a brother-in-law, and a German immigrant who had disappeared decades earlier. Every transient who had passed through town was questioned. Every stranger who couldn't account for his whereabouts became a person of interest. One of them was a man named Andrew Sawyer. He was interrogated but never charged. What stood out about Sawyer was his behavior after the murders. He became obsessed with the case. He slept fully clothed, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice, and he kept an axe next to his bed. But the most prominent suspect, and the only one who ever stood trial, was Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was an English-born traveling minister who happened to be in Villisca on the night of the murders. He had come to town on the 8th of June to teach at the Children's Day services, the same services the Moore family attended the following evening. He left Villisca between 5 and 5:50 a.m. on the 10th of June, hours before the bodies were found. Kelly was described by people who knew him as peculiar. He had reportedly suffered a mental breakdown as an adolescent. As an adult, he had been accused of peeping and of asking young women and girls to pose nude for him on multiple occasions. In the weeks after the murders, Kelly couldn't stop talking about the case. He wrote letter after letter to police, to investigators, to the families of the dead. A private investigator decided to test him and wrote back, asking Kelly what details he might know. Kelly responded with striking specificity. He claimed to have heard sounds that night. He said he may have witnessed parts of the murders. The question became impossible to answer. Did he know these details because he committed the crime, or was he imagining it? In 1914, 2 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested for sending obscene material through the mail. He had been sexually harassing a woman who applied for a job as his secretary. He was sent to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the National Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. Investigators circled back to him again. Eventually, in 1917, Kelly was arrested for the Villisca murders. Police obtained a confession, but it came after hours of interrogation, and Kelly recanted it afterward. He confessed in court as well. The jury didn't believe him. His first trial ended in a hung jury. His second ended in an acquittal. Then there was Frank Fernando Jones, a Villisca resident, an Iowa state senator, and Josiah Moore's former employer. Josiah had worked at Jones's implement store for years before leaving to open his own competing business. He reportedly took significant trade away from Jones, including a lucrative John Deere dealership. There were also rumors that Josiah had been having a sexual affair with Jones's daughter-in-law. No evidence ever supported this. The theory was that Jones didn't kill the Moores himself. He hired someone to do it. That someone, according to investigators, was William Mansfield. Mansfield was known as Insane Blackie, an ex-convict, a former U.S. Army soldier who had been stationed at Fort Leavenworth, and according to Detective James Newton Wilkerson of the Burns Detective Agency, a cocaine-addicted serial killer. Wilkerson built a case that Mansfield was responsible for a string of eerily similar axe murders. 9 months before Villisca, a family was killed with an axe in Colorado Springs, then another in Ellsworth, Kansas, then another in Paola, Kansas, just 4 days before the Moore family was murdered. The details were almost identical across the cases. Victims hacked to death in their beds, mirrors covered, a lamp left burning with the chimney removed, a basin of bloody water in the kitchen where the killer had washed, gloves worn to avoid leaving fingerprints. Wilkerson believed the gloves were key. Mansfield had served time at Leavenworth. His fingerprints were on file. He would have known to keep them off the axe. Wilkerson also believed Mansfield was behind the axe murders of his own wife, infant child, father-in-law, and mother-in-law in Blue Island, Illinois, in 1914, and the murders of 2 women in Aurora, Illinois. In 1916, Wilkerson convinced a grand jury to open an investigation. Mansfield was arrested and brought to Montgomery County. But payroll records placed Mansfield in Illinois at the time of the Villisca murders. He was released for lack of evidence. He later sued Wilkerson and won. He was awarded $2,225 in damages. Wilkerson believed the fix was in. He believed that Senator Jones had pressured authorities to release Mansfield and redirect attention toward Reverend Kelly instead. And there was one loose thread that never got pulled. A restaurant owner from Shenandoah, Iowa, named R.H. Thorpe, identified Mansfield as the man he saw on the morning after the murders. The man was boarding a train at Clarinda and said he had walked from Villisca. If true, that would have destroyed Mansfield's alibi. A woman named Vina Tompkins from Marshalltown was reportedly on her way to testify that she had overheard 3 men in the woods plotting to kill the Moore family shortly before the murders took place. Neither of these leads went anywhere. Then there was Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the murdered family. Moore was convicted in 1912 of killing his own mother and grandmother with an axe. The method was strikingly similar to the Villisca murders and to the other axe killings across the Midwest. This led some investigators to suspect that Moore was behind all of them, that he was the serial killer the press had started calling Billy the Axeman. But in 2006, researcher Bate Klingensmith re-examined the evidence and argued against Moore being the Axeman. Josiah's own brother-in-law, Samuel Elias Moyer, was also looked at. He had apparently made threats against Josiah on more than one occasion, but his alibi held up and he was cleared. The last suspect came decades later. In 2017, author Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James published a book called The Man from the Train. They re-examined the Billy the Axeman theory and expanded it dramatically, connecting dozens of similar family murders stretching back years before Villisca. Their conclusion was that the killer was a man named Paul Mueller, a German-speaking immigrant. In 1897, Mueller had been the sole suspect in the murder of a family in West Brookfield, Massachusetts. The family had employed him as a farmhand. A year-long manhunt followed. Mueller was never found. James and McCarthy James believe he kept killing for over a decade, moving by rail, targeting families in small towns, entering their homes at night, using their own axes against them. And then, like so many things in this case, the trail simply ends. No one was ever convicted of the Villisca Axe murders, not the minister who confessed and wasn't believed, not the senator who may have hired a killer, not the ex-convict who may have been seen boarding a train, not the farmhand who vanished in 1897. Everyone was suspected, no one was proven. That's the story of what happened in Villisca. The facts, the timeline, and the suspects who were never convicted. But knowing what happened doesn't answer the deeper question, the one that has kept people coming back to this case for over a century. Why did the killer stay in the house after the murders were done? Why cover every mirror? Why leave a slab of bacon next to the axe? Why did Lena Stillinger's body look different from the rest? In part 2, we're going to go through the psychology behind this case. Not to solve it, but to understand what kind of mind could have done this, and what the details he left behind might tell us about who he was. Most killers leave, whether driven by panic, by self-preservation, or simply by the adrenaline crash that follows extreme violence. The majority of murderers want distance between themselves and what they've done as quickly as possible. The Villisca killer didn't do that. After murdering 8 people, he remained inside the house. He moved through the rooms, he covered mirrors, he adjusted a lamp, he washed his hands. He placed objects deliberately, he locked the doors. In forensic behavioral analysis, there's an important distinction between what's called modus operandi and what's called signature behavior. Modus operandi is everything the killer does because he needs to, it's functional. Entering through an unlocked door is modus operandi. Striking the adult male first to eliminate the biggest physical threat is modus operandi. These are practical decisions that serve the goal of committing the crime and getting away with it. Signature behavior is different. It's everything the killer does that he doesn't need to. Actions that serve no practical purpose in carrying out the crime or avoiding detection, but that he does anyway because something inside him compels it. Covering the mirrors was not necessary. Turning the lamp down to a faint glow instead of simply putting it out was not necessary. Taking a slab of bacon from the icebox and placing it next to the murder weapon was not necessary. Locking every door from the inside before leaving was not necessary. None of these actions helped the killer escape. If anything, they delayed his escape. He spent time doing these things while 8 bodies lay around him in a house that any neighbor could have approached at any moment. And that's what makes this case so psychologically distinctive. The signature behaviors aren't just present, they dominate the aftermath of the crime. When a killer lingers at a scene and arranges objects, some behavioral analysts describe it as a form of staging. The killer is composing the scene, not for investigators, not for the public, but for himself. He is fulfilling some internal need that exists separately from the act of killing. The question is what that need was. One interpretation has to do with the mirrors. Covering every reflective surface in a house is rare, but it's not unique to Villisca. It appeared in several of the other axe murders linked to this period, in Colorado Springs, in Ellsworth, in Paula. The same behavior, repeated across different crime scenes, suggests it wasn't random or situational. It was part of who this person was. Some criminal psychologists would interpret this as an aversion to being observed, even by his own reflection. Looking at the pattern, it could be that the killer experienced some form of psychological splitting, the ability to commit extreme violence while simultaneously being unable to confront what he had done. Covering the mirrors may have been his way of sealing himself off from the reality of the scene. As long as he couldn't see himself in it, he could continue to function inside it. Others have suggested a more superstitious explanation. In some cultural traditions, mirrors are covered after a death to prevent the soul of the deceased from becoming trapped. If the killer held some version of this belief, the mirror covering could represent a ritualistic behavior rooted in guilt, religion, or magical thinking. Either interpretation points to the same conclusion. This was not a man acting out of pure, cold practicality. Something emotional or psychological was happening in that house after the killing stopped, something he needed to do before he could leave. And then there's the lamp. He didn't work in total darkness, and he didn't turn on full light. He removed the glass chimney from the kerosene lamp and turned the wick down to the faintest possible glow. Looking at this behavior, it could suggest a kind of psychological compartmentalization. He wanted to see just enough to do what he needed to do, but not enough to fully confront it. He existed in a space between darkness and light, literally and possibly psychologically. Enough awareness to move, to arrange, to claim. Not enough to be overwhelmed by what surrounded him. This is not consistent with someone in a frenzy. Someone acting out of uncontrolled rage doesn't carefully adjust a lamp, remove the chimney, and set it aside. That level of fine motor control and deliberate decision-making in the immediate aftermath of killing 8 people points to something else entirely. It points to someone who had learned how to manage himself inside these moments. Someone who had been in rooms like this before and had developed a process for how to exist in them afterward. Which brings us to the detail that no one has ever been able to explain. The bacon, a 4-pound slab taken from the icebox, placed on the floor next to the axe. Some have speculated it was a meal the killer intended to eat but didn't. Others have suggested it was used to wipe blood from the axe, though there's no forensic evidence of that. Some have simply called it inexplicable and moved on. But in behavioral analysis, when an object is placed at a crime scene in a deliberate way, and that object serves no functional purpose, it's generally considered part of the signature. It meant something to the killer, even if it means nothing to us. And the honest answer is that we don't know what it meant. We may never know. But the fact that it's there, alongside the covered mirrors, the dimmed lamp, the locked doors, the bloody water on the kitchen table, tells us something important about the person who did this. He wasn't just killing, he was performing something. A sequence of actions that followed the violence that may have been just as important to him as the violence itself. A private ritual carried out in near darkness, surrounded by the people he had just destroyed, in a house he had sealed shut from the inside. And when he was finished, he left and locked the door behind him. Seven of the 8 victims in the Moore house showed no signs of resistance. No defensive wounds, no indication that they moved or struggled. They were killed in their sleep, likely without ever knowing what was happening to them. Lena Stillinger was different. She was found lying crosswise on the bed, which is not how a person sleeps. There was a wound on her arm consistent with raising it to block a blow. Her body had been repositioned after death, placed on her stomach, and her undergarments had been removed. Her leg had been arranged in a way that investigators at the time interpreted as deliberately exposing her. Later investigations found no physical evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. But someone had taken the time to move her, to undress her partially, and to position her in a specific way after she was already dead. This distinction matters because it separates what happened to Lena from what happened to everyone else in that house. In criminal psychology, there's a category of violent crimes sometimes referred to as lust murder. It doesn't necessarily involve a sexual act in the way most people would understand it. What defines it is that the violence itself, or the aftermath of the violence, serves a sexual or psychosexual purpose for the killer. The staging of the body, the positioning, the removal of clothing, these can function as substitutes for a physical act or as an end in themselves. Looking at what happened to Lena Stillinger, it's possible that the positioning of her body was the point, not a precursor to something else, not an interrupted act, but the thing itself. This raises an uncomfortable question about the entire case. Was Lena the reason the killer chose this house? It's impossible to know for certain, but in cases where a killer targets a household and one victim receives markedly different post-mortem treatment, behavioral analysts often consider the possibility that the individual victim was the primary target and the rest of the household was collateral. The family wasn't killed to get to Lena specifically, but Lena may have been the reason the killer lingered, the reason he didn't simply leave after the murders were done. It's worth noting that Lena and her sister Inez weren't supposed to be there that night. They were last-minute guests. Mary Catherine Moore invited them to sleep over after the church service. If the killer had been watching the house from the barn before the family left for church, he would not have known the Stillinger sisters would be coming back with them. If he was already hiding in the attic when the family returned, he would have heard 2 extra voices, 2 extra sets of footsteps, 2 additional people settling into the downstairs guest room. This could mean one of 2 things. It could mean that the Stillinger sisters were entirely incidental. They were simply in the wrong place, and the killer would have carried out the same attack regardless of who was sleeping in that guest room. Or it could mean that something about their presence changed the nature of the crime. That once the killer became aware of them, a young girl sleeping in a room he would pass through, something shifted in his motivation. There's also the detail that Lena appeared to have woken up. She was the only one who fought back, which means there may have been a moment, brief and terrifying in near total darkness, where Lena Stillinger and her killer were face to face. She was 11 years old. She raised her arm to protect herself, and it wasn't enough. What the killer did to her body afterward, in the quiet of that house with everyone else already dead, tells us that whatever drove him wasn't satisfied by the act of killing alone. There was something else he needed from the scene, something that only Lena's body could provide. Whether that need was sexual, psychological, or some combination of both, it places this crime in a specific and disturbing category. It suggests a killer whose violence wasn't purely instrumental. It had a dimension to it that was personal, intimate, and deeply rooted in something that existed long before he ever entered the Moore house. The other 7 victims were obstacles or opportunities. Looking at the pattern, Lena Stillinger may have been something else entirely. One of the most important questions in any murder investigation is whether the crime is the killer's first. A first-time killer makes mistakes. He hasn't yet learned what careful looks like, so the scene tends to be messier, less controlled, and more emotionally chaotic than what comes after. The Villisca crime scene shows none of those qualities. The killer entered the house undetected, waited patiently in the attic for what may have been hours, and then moved through a small, creaking farmhouse in the dark and killed 8 people in their beds without a single one of them alerting the others. He then spent an extended period of time inside the house, performing a detailed sequence of post-mortem behaviors before leaving through a locked door. This is not the work of someone figuring it out as he goes. In behavioral analysis, there's a concept called a mature modus operandi. It refers to a pattern of criminal behavior that is too refined, too efficient, and too consistent to be someone's first offense. The idea is straightforward: every killer learns. The first time is driven more by impulse and less by planning, but with each subsequent crime the process gets tighter. Unnecessary risks get eliminated, the things that work get repeated, the things that almost went wrong get corrected. By the time a modus operandi looks mature, the person behind it has usually committed multiple offenses. The learning has already happened somewhere else, at some earlier crime scene that may or may not have been connected. And this is where the Villisca case stops being a single isolated event and becomes something much larger. Between September of 1911 and June of 1912, a series of family murders occurred across the American Midwest. In Colorado Springs, the Burnham and Wayne families were killed with an axe on the same night. A few weeks later, the Dawson family was murdered in Monmouth, Illinois. Then the Showman family in Ellsworth, Kansas. Then the Hudson family in Paola, Kansas, just 4 days before Villisca. The similarities across these crimes are not vague or coincidental. They are specific, repeated, and precise. In each case, an entire family was killed at night in their beds with an axe, typically the blunt side. In each case, the killer covered the victims' faces after death. In each case, mirrors in the house were covered. In each case, a lamp was found with its chimney removed and the wick turned low. In each case, a basin or evidence of the killer washing was found in the kitchen. In each case, nothing of value was taken. And in each case, the crime scene was located near a railroad. This last detail is what led investigators and later researchers to believe the killer was traveling by train, hopping freight cars between small towns, selecting a house, watching it, entering it at night, and then disappearing down the tracks before morning. When the same specific behaviors appear at crime scenes separated by hundreds of miles and multiple months, behavioral analysts generally rule out coincidence. The likelihood of 2 or more different killers independently developing the exact same ritual, covering mirrors, adjusting lamp wicks, washing at the scene, staging victims, locking doors, is extremely low. What it points to instead is a single individual refining and repeating a process that worked for him. And that process, by the time it reached Villisca, was remarkably advanced. Consider what the killer had to get right on the night of the 9th of June, 1912. He had to identify the house. He had to observe it long enough to understand the family's routine. He had to enter without being detected, find a hiding place in the attic, and remain silent and motionless while 8 people moved through the rooms below him. He had to wait until everyone was deeply asleep. He had to navigate the house in near total darkness. He had to kill the most physically dangerous victim first. He had to move between rooms and between floors without making enough noise to wake anyone who was still alive. And then he had to carry out his post-mortem ritual, the mirrors, the lamp, the staging, the washing, the locking, all while managing whatever psychological state he was in after killing 8 people. Every single one of those steps went according to plan. That doesn't happen the first time, or the second, or likely even the third. Looking at the full pattern of Midwest axe murders between 1911 and 1912, what we may be seeing is not a series of separate crimes, but a single career. A killer who started somewhere, learned from each scene, and arrived at Villisca with a process so practiced that he could murder an entire household and spend an extended period inside the house afterward without rushing, without panicking, and without leaving behind a single piece of evidence that could identify him. Authors Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James took this idea even further in their 2017 book. They argued that the series didn't begin in 1911, but potentially stretched back to 1898 or earlier, with a suspect named Paul Mueller who disappeared after being linked to a family murder in Massachusetts. If their theory is correct, the killer who entered the Moore house that night may have had over a decade of experience behind him. And Villisca wasn't the beginning of his story. It may have simply been the chapter that the world happened to notice. Of all the suspects in the Villisca case, Reverend George Kelly is the most psychologically fascinating. Not because the evidence against him was strong. In many ways, it was remarkably weak. But because Kelly did something that most innocent people never do, and that is confessing. He confessed to police after hours of interrogation. He confessed again in open court, and then he was acquitted because the jury that heard his confession didn't believe a word of it. To understand how that's possible, you have to understand something about the psychology of false confessions and about the kind of mind that produces them. Kelly had a documented history of mental illness stretching back to his adolescence, when he reportedly suffered a severe breakdown. As an adult, he was accused multiple times of voyeurism and of asking young women and girls to pose nude for him. He was eventually institutionalized at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the National Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C., after being arrested for sexually harassing a woman through the mail. None of this makes him a killer, but it does paint a picture of someone whose relationship with reality, with boundaries, and with his own impulses was deeply unstable. And it's that instability that makes his behavior after the murders so difficult to interpret. In the weeks following the killings, Kelly became consumed by the case. He wrote letters constantly to the police, to investigators, to the families of the victims. Not short, casual letters, detailed, extensive correspondence that showed an intense preoccupation with every aspect of what had happened. When a private investigator wrote back and asked Kelly what he knew, Kelly responded with vivid specifics. He claimed to have heard sounds on the night of the murders. He said he may have witnessed parts of what happened. The question that investigators struggled with then, and that researchers still struggle with now, is where that knowledge came from. There are really only two possibilities. Either Kelly was there that night and participated in or committed the murders, and his detailed knowledge came from first-hand experience. Or Kelly was not there, and his mind constructed a version of events so vivid and so detailed that he himself could no longer distinguish it from memory. This second possibility is not as unlikely as it sounds. In the study of false confessions, researchers have identified a category sometimes called internalized false confessions. These occur when a person doesn't just say they committed a crime to end an interrogation or to get attention, they actually come to believe they did it. This typically happens to people who are psychologically vulnerable in specific ways. They may have a fragile sense of identity. They may be highly suggestible. They may have difficulty distinguishing between things they imagined and things they experienced. They may have a pre-existing need to be at the center of dramatic events, even terrible ones. Kelly fits several of these criteria. His obsessive letter writing suggests someone who needed to be involved in the case, who couldn't tolerate being on the outside of it. His history of mental illness suggests someone whose grip on reality was already compromised. His willingness to provide increasingly specific details that may or may not have been accurate, suggests someone who was filling in gaps with imagination and then treating those inventions as truth. And then there's the confession itself. It came after hours of interrogation. Long interrogations are one of the most reliable predictors of false confessions, because the psychological pressure of sustained questioning can break down a person's ability to maintain their own version of events. They begin to absorb the interrogator's narrative, they start to agree with suggestions, and eventually they confess, not because they remember doing it, but because the interrogation has made them uncertain enough about their own mind that confessing feels like the path of least resistance. Kelly recanted his confession afterward. This is also consistent with the pattern of internalized false confessions. Once the pressure of the interrogation is removed, the person's original sense of reality begins to reassert itself, and they realize that what they said wasn't true. But then Kelly confessed again in court, without the pressure of an interrogation room. This is where it gets complicated. If his confession was purely a product of interrogation pressure, it shouldn't have resurfaced in a courtroom setting. The fact that it did suggests that Kelly's relationship with the Villisca murders had become something deeper than a coerced statement. Looking at the pattern of his behavior, the obsessive letters, the claims of having witnessed the crime, the repeated confessions, it's possible that Kelly had developed what some psychologists would describe as a delusional identification with the crime. The murders had become so central to his psychological world that he had, in some sense, absorbed them into his identity. He may not have killed anyone in that house, but in his mind, he may have been unable to separate himself from what happened there. The jury seemed to sense this. They heard a man confess to 8 murders and decided he was not credible. That's an extraordinary thing for a jury to do. It suggests that something about the way Kelly presented his confession, the affect, the details, the manner of delivery, didn't match what they expected from a genuine admission of guilt. What they were likely seeing, without having the psychological vocabulary to describe it, was a man whose confession came from a place of mental illness rather than from a place of genuine memory. Therefore, Kelly was acquitted. He remains one of the most discussed suspects in the case, not because the evidence points to him, but because his behavior raises a question that sits at the heart of criminal psychology. What does it mean when someone confesses to a crime they may not have committed and believes it? And if Kelly didn't do it, what does it say about the real killer that someone else's mind could be so thoroughly consumed by his work? Within an hour of the bodies being discovered, hundreds of people had walked through the Moore house. They touched the murder weapon, they stepped through blood, they picked up fragments of bone and carried them home. From a modern perspective, this is almost incomprehensible. The idea of civilians flooding an active crime scene, handling evidence, and taking souvenirs feels like something that couldn't happen, that someone would have stopped it. But in 1912 Villisca, no one did, not for hours. And the reason why has less to do with incompetent policing than it does with something deeply embedded in human psychology. There is a well-documented phenomenon called morbid curiosity. It describes the pull that people feel toward death, violence, and the macabre, even when that pull conflicts with their own sense of decency or self-preservation. Researchers have studied this extensively, and what they've found is that morbid curiosity isn't a sign of something wrong with a person. It's nearly universal. It's the reason people slow down to look at car accidents. It's the reason true crime is one of the most consumed genres of media in the world. It's the reason you're listening to this right now. The prevailing theory is that morbid curiosity evolved as a survival mechanism. By paying close attention to how other people died, early humans gathered information about threats in their environment. The impulse to look at death, to study it, to get close to it, isn't morbid in the pathological sense. It's the brain trying to learn something that might keep it alive. But what happened in the Moore house goes beyond simply looking. People took pieces of Josiah's skull. They handled the axe. They moved through the rooms not as investigators, but as spectators at something they had no framework for processing. To understand that, you have to consider what death looked like in 1912. In the early 20th century, most people had a much more direct relationship with death than we do today. People died at home. Families washed and prepared the bodies themselves. Children saw dead relatives laid out in the parlor. Death was physically present in everyday life in a way that it simply isn't anymore. But murder was different. A family dying of illness was something people understood. 8 people bludgeoned in their beds with an axe was something else entirely. Villisca had no frame of reference for this. There was no true crime media. There were no forensic television shows teaching people what a crime scene was and why you shouldn't touch anything. The concept of evidence contamination barely existed outside of a few major city police departments. When the telephone operator sent that all-call alert to every household in town, she wasn't just spreading news. She was issuing an unintentional invitation. And people came because the human brain, when confronted with something it cannot comprehend, has an overwhelming need to see it firsthand. There's a psychological concept called the need for cognitive closure. It describes the discomfort people feel when they are confronted with ambiguity or incomplete information, and the lengths they will go to in order to resolve that discomfort. Hearing that 8 of your neighbors had been murdered with an axe creates an enormous amount of cognitive ambiguity. The mind races with questions it cannot answer. What does that look like? How is that possible? Could it happen to me? Am I safe? Walking into that house and seeing the scene with your own eyes is, psychologically, an attempt to answer those questions. It doesn't actually make you safer. It doesn't give you useful information, but it gives the brain the feeling of having confronted the threat directly, which temporarily reduces the anxiety of not knowing. That's why hundreds of people walked through that house, not because they were callous, not because they didn't care about the Moore family, but because their brains were demanding information that only their own eyes could provide. The souvenirs are harder to explain, but not impossible. Taking a physical object from a site of extreme violence is a behavior that has been observed across cultures and throughout history. Soldiers take trophies from battlefields. Spectators took fragments of the scaffold after public executions. Pieces of the Berlin Wall were chipped off and carried away by thousands of people within hours of it coming down. The impulse seems to be rooted in a desire to possess a piece of something historically significant, something larger than yourself. It's not rational. The person carrying home a fragment of Josiah Moore's skull was probably not thinking about why they were doing it. They were acting on an impulse that they likely couldn't have articulated if you'd asked them. But the result was devastating. Every person who walked through that house removed something, not just physical objects, but context. Footprints were trampled, blood patterns were disturbed, the positions of objects were shifted, the axe that could have held fingerprints was passed through hundreds of hands. By the time Dr. Lindquist convinced the sheriff to call in the National Guard, the crime scene had been functionally erased. And this is perhaps the cruelest irony of the entire case. The town of Villisca didn't destroy the evidence because they didn't care about justice. They destroyed it because they were human, because they were terrified, and because in 1912, no one had taught them that the worst thing you can do after a murder is exactly what every instinct in your body is telling you to do. Walk in, look, touch, try to understand. The killer locked the house from the inside before he left. The town broke it open and undid whatever he might have left behind. In a sense, the townspeople of Villisca completed the killer's work for him. More than a century has passed since the night of the 9th of June, 1912. No one was ever convicted. Every suspect was either acquitted, cleared, or simply faded from the investigation without resolution. The killer, whoever he was, almost certainly lived out the rest of his life without ever being held accountable for what happened in that house. And yet the case refuses to die. Books are still written about it, podcasts still cover it. Researchers still argue about whether it was Kelly, Mansfield, Mueller, or someone whose name was never even recorded. The house itself still stands on that quiet street in Villisca. It was restored to its 1912 condition in the 1990s. Today, you can tour it during the day or pay to spend the night inside it. People do, and that regularly. They sleep in the rooms where 8 people were murdered. Some come looking for ghosts, some come out of curiosity. Some come because they've heard the story and need to see it for themselves. But beneath all of that, the tourism, the books, the podcasts, the debates, there is a psychological reason why this case still has a grip on people after more than 100 years. And it has to do with how the human brain processes unfinished stories. In psychology, there's a well-known principle called the Zeigarnik effect. It was first described in the 1920s by psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who observed that people remember uncompleted tasks far better than completed ones. The explanation is that when a task or a story is finished, the brain files it away. It gets categorized, stored, and largely forgotten. The mental tension around it dissolves because there's nothing left to resolve. But when something remains unfinished, the brain keeps it active. It stays in a kind of open loop, taking up mental resources, periodically resurfacing, demanding attention. This is why a song stuck in your head is almost always one that got cut off before the end. It's why cliffhangers work. It's why you can remember the details of an argument that was never resolved far more clearly than one that was. The Villisca Axe Murders are, psychologically speaking, one of the largest open loops in American criminal history. 8 people were killed. The crime scene was described in extraordinary detail. Multiple suspects were identified, investigated, and discussed at length. And then nothing happened, no one was held responsible, and no definitive answer was ever reached. The brain cannot accept that. It keeps returning to the case, turning it over, trying different suspects, re-examining the evidence, looking for the piece that might finally close the loop. This is why you're still listening right now, not because the facts of the case are especially complex, they aren't. The crime itself was brutally straightforward, but because the absence of an ending creates a psychological tension that your brain is actively trying to resolve. And it can't because there is no ending. There's another layer to this, and it's specific to violent crime. When a murder is solved, the fear it generates gets attached to a specific person. The killer has a name, a face, a story. He becomes a contained threat, something the brain can categorize and file away under "this is who did it, and here's why." When a murder is unsolved, the fear has nowhere to land. The killer is still out there, at least in the psychological sense. Even if he's been dead for decades, the fact that he was never identified means the brain can't fully process him as a resolved threat. He remains abstract and faceless, and because of that, he can be anyone. That's why unsolved cases feel different from solved ones. It's not just the absence of justice, it's the absence of containment. The threat was never boxed in, never given a name, never reduced from something vast and unknown to something specific and understood. In Villisca, this effect is amplified by the nature of the crime itself. This wasn't a targeted killing between people who knew each other. This was a stranger entering a family's home in the middle of the night and destroying everyone inside it. That kind of crime strikes at something fundamental, the belief that your home is safe, that locking your door means something, that the people sleeping around you will still be there in the morning. The Villisca killer violated all of those assumptions, and because he was never caught, those assumptions were never restored. For the town of Villisca, this wasn't just a murder. It was a rupture in the basic sense of safety that a community depends on. And because that rupture was never repaired by an arrest, a trial, and a conviction, it has persisted in some form for over a century. The house still stands, people still visit, the debates still continue. And somewhere in the back of every person who reads about this case or listens to this story, the same quiet question lingers. If they never found out who did it, how do you know it couldn't happen again? That question has no answer, and that is exactly why it never goes away. If you've made it this far, I'm curious, which suspect do you think came closest? Kelly, Mansfield, Mueller, or someone who was never even on the list? Let me know in the comments, and now have a good rest.